tens of millions in corporate debt, a collapsed real estate empire, and one flawless actress chosen to pay the price. Her destruction was never a conventional tragedy of a broken heart. It was a hostile corporate takeover. This is the anatomy of a 10-year love debt, the forensic reality of how Carman Lee was used to save a billionaire's fortune. She wasn't his partner. She was a human ATM, systematically liquidated to balance a ledger. Approaching the 1997 handover, Hong Kong ran on speculative capital and geopolitical anxiety. The entertainment industry operated strictly as a high-velocity asset class, heavily influenced by underground syndicates. The mandate was brutal: produce at an impossible speed and ruthlessly discard human components when profit margins declined. In a morally flexible society, the dirtier the syndicate money flowing through production companies, the purer the stars needed to appear on screen. The public demanded an illusion of absolute moral perfection to distract from their own reality. Carman Lee entered this cinematic meat grinder with a psychological profile perfectly primed for exploitation. A commercial flight attendant, she was professionally trained for serene detachment, to smile at demanding strangers, absorb conflict, and completely subordinate her own needs. Discovered by accident, she was thrust into a studio system that immediately recognized the immense financial value of her ultimate uncomplaining compliance. By 1995, she was the undisputed center of gravity in the Asian entertainment industry. Her casting as the Little Dragon Maiden in the definitive martial arts television epic of the decade permanently locked her fate. The Little Dragon Maiden was not merely a television role. It was a suffocating, inescapable archetype. The character is a martial arts prodigy who lives inside an ancient sealed tomb, utterly devoid of worldly desires, pure of heart, and entirely removed from the dirt of human transaction. She wears white, she speaks softly, and she remains eternally uncorrupted. The public immediately and violently conflated the actress with the fiction. They refused to separate Carman Lee, the human being, from the flawless goddess she portrayed on television. She commanded the highest fees in the territory. She was a relentless, highly efficient money printer for her management, her studios, and herself. Her face moved consumer products, dictated regional fashion trends, and dominated the collective consciousness of millions. However, a severe and often fatal trap is always embedded in that specific brand of explosive, archetype-driven success. When an individual is elevated to the status of an absolute, unblemished idol, they cease to be treated as a human being and become a heavily managed, fiercely guarded corporate product. The more aggressively the audience demands purity, the more drastically the real woman is isolated from normal human interaction. The operational rules of the Hong Kong studio system were absolutely not written to protect Carman Lee's mental health or personal development. They were drafted by studio executives, producers, and financiers to protect the continuous cash flow generated by her pristine image. The immense public love she received was the exact raw material used to build the walls of her gilded cage. To maintain the illusion she could not be seen engaging in the normal, messy realities of a woman in her late 20s. She was barred from casual dating, from expressing controversial opinions, and from stepping outside the heavily curated boundaries of the Jade Girl persona. At the absolute zenith of this fame, Carman Lee operated under a massive illusion of control. She possessed immense liquid wealth, unprecedented global recognition, and the apparent ability to dictate her own production schedule. But behind the iron curtain of her celebrity, a profound and dangerous psychological isolation was festering. The entertainment industry discards female talent with ruthless mathematical efficiency the moment they approach the age of 40. Carman was a woman navigating her late 20s in an environment explicitly designed to eventually replace her with a younger, cheaper iteration of the same archetype. The paparazzi of the era, functioning as aggressive enforcers of the purity mandate, documented a stark, recurring reality that the adoring public largely ignored. Despite being the most desired woman in the city, the absolute pinnacle of beauty and success, she was frequently photographed dining entirely alone. She moved quietly through the chaotic city with a minuscule, tightly controlled inner circle. She possessed massive fame, yet lacked a genuine human anchor. She lived in a state of suspended animation. Untouched by the city's gritty reality, she remained dangerously vulnerable to anyone offering quiet, authoritative intimacy. This illusion of control is the primary and most effective weapon in any sophisticated manipulator's arsenal. A highly developed system of exploitation allows the target to believe they are managing their own wealth and making autonomous life choices. But true, systemic power never resides on a soundstage or in front of a camera. In the brutally hierarchical ecosystem of 1990s Hong Kong, absolute power resided exclusively in the executive boardrooms of the central business district and the opaque interconnected networks of the property market. Carman Lee, a woman whose entire societal and financial value was anchored to a fragile fantasy of innocence, was swimming directly into deep waters controlled by apex predators. She was a highly valuable, highly isolated asset, waiting for a manager. A seasoned, effective manipulator rarely announces his arrival with a threat or a demand. He breaches the target's perimeter disguised as a savior. He identifies the specific psychological void created by the target's environment and fills it completely. For Carman Lee, that void was the crushing weight of her own enforced perfection and the terrifying loneliness of the summit. The board was set. The asset was isolated. The transaction was about to begin. The arrival of Martin Kwok in 1996 was a masterpiece of strategic positioning. Emerging far from the frantic ecosystem of the Hong Kong film studios, Martin Kwok was a wealthy tycoon, the established chairman of a publicly listed holding company, and 20 years her senior. In a city entirely obsessed with youth and cinematic illusion, he brought the heavy, undeniable gravity of a man who commanded real-world capital. He had already navigated the complexities of marriage, divorce, and the brutal realities of high-stakes corporate warfare. When he initiated contact with Carman Lee, he bypassed the standard protocols of celebrity courtship. He did not approach her with the frantic energy of a fan or the transactional desperation of a producer. He approached her with the calm, methodical, and profoundly reassuring sincerity of a man offering an impenetrable fortress. He positioned himself firmly outside the chaotic orbit of her daily career. He offered an anchor to a woman who had been drifting in the terrifying vacuum of extreme fame. He enveloped her reality, establishing himself not just as a romantic partner, but as the sole voice of reason in a world composed entirely of opportunists. He presented himself as the ultimate mature solution to her chronic isolation. He was the adult in the room, the sophisticated protector who could shield the pure, exhausted goddess from the dirty machinery of her own industry. For a woman whose entire existence had been commodified by the public, the offer of private, secure, and authoritative protection was an irresistible psychological relief. She allowed him to map her vulnerabilities. She granted him absolute access. The architecture of the trap was flawless. He secured her absolute trust and integrated himself into her core identity, just as the geopolitical tectonic plates of Asia began to violently shift. The summer of 1997 did not merely alter the financial markets, it eradicated the economic foundations of the continent. The Asian financial crisis struck Hong Kong not as a slow recession, but as a localized seismic event, specifically targeting the hyperinflated property market and the highly leveraged speculative portfolios of the city's elite. Overnight, the Hang Seng Index plummeted. The massive real estate valuations that propped up the city's tycoons evaporated in a matter of hours, leaving colossal uncollateralized holes in the balance sheets of aggressive holding companies. Martin Kwok was heavily and fatally exposed. The corporate empire he had built, the very foundation of the sophisticated, unshakable authority he had presented to Carman Lee, was instantly hollowed out. The illusion of the protector shattered. He was suddenly carrying tens of millions of dollars in corporate debt. The margin calls arrived. The creditors began circling. The tycoon was facing total public humiliation and absolute financial annihilation. A conventional narrative of romance dictates that a protector shields his partner from his own ruin. A man operating on a foundation of genuine care would have severed the financial and emotional ties, actively insulating the woman he loved from the catastrophic fallout of his own over-leveraged bets. He would have recognized that her pristine public image and her personal wealth were entirely separate from his corporate failures. Martin Kwok executed the exact opposite maneuver. He did not release her. He identified her. In the wreckage of his financial empire, he recognized that Carman Lee's career, her flawless public reputation, and her unprecedented earning potential constituted his singular remaining liquid asset. The crisis provided the perfect, unassailable cover to transition from a romantic partner into a financial parasite. He recognized that her career was an unregulated insurance policy. The transaction formally commenced. The initial phase of this hostile takeover was not explicitly financial. It was entirely psychological. It consisted of a series of subtle, calculated warning shots designed to test the perimeter of her compliance. He weaponized his own newfound vulnerability. He reframed his colossal business failure not as a consequence of his own corporate greed or poor risk management, but as a tragic external injustice that had befallen them both. He positioned himself as a victim, requiring her ultimate sacrifice. He inverted the dynamic. The protector now required protection. If she truly possessed the purity she projected on screen, if she truly loved him beyond the superficial metrics of wealth, she would prove it now in his darkest hour. This demand for sacrifice immediately targeted her autonomy. He began instituting an emotional cage, establishing arbitrary, highly restrictive rules disguised as protective concern. The first targets were the minute details of her physical presentation and her professional choices. He objected to her continuing to work in specific genres of film, claiming the chaotic environments and the associations with certain directors degraded her prestige. He systematically attacked her personal aesthetic. He demanded she alter her daily wardrobe, enforcing a conservative, almost muted visual identity that contrasted sharply with the glamorous expectations of a leading actress. He specifically banned the use of bright nail polish and high-fashion garments. The objective of these restrictions was never about preserving a public reputation. The objective was physical and psychological containment. By controlling the microscopic details of how she presented herself to the world, he was slowly severing her connection to the independent, highly visible identity that made her powerful. He was eroding her agency. He was transforming an untouchable idol into a domesticated, subservient caretaker whose primary function was to manage his anxiety. Carman Lee complied. She operated under the fatal, culturally ingrained misconception that total submission was the ultimate expression of female devotion. She yielded to every demand, internalizing the belief that her personal sacrifices, her willingness to diminish her own presence, would secure his emotional stability and ultimately save the relationship. She allowed the boundaries of her own identity to dissolve, convinced she was executing a noble rescue operation. She did not realize the drowning man was systematically using her as a flotation device, perfectly willing to push her head under the surface to secure his own breath. She later admitted in a rare moment of retrospective clarity, "I always yielded, thinking that sacrifice would bring happiness." She was operating on a fundamentally flawed model of transaction, where her compliance was supposed to purchase his loyalty. By late 1997, the psychological conditioning had successfully primed her for the next phase, the financial extraction. Kwok's corporate debts were no longer a private matter. They were public knowledge across the territory. His reputation was bleeding out in the financial districts. The Hong Kong entertainment industry, an ecosystem built on ruthless pragmatism and rapid intelligence gathering, immediately detected the shift. Studio executives, independent producers, and underground financiers knew that the little dragon maiden, previously untouchable and highly selective, was suddenly desperate for massive, immediate cash injections to service her partner's collapsing empire. Unreported industry rumors from late 1997 indicated Carman Lee had begun quietly meeting with aggressive film producers. Instead of discussing prestigious roles, these were raw negotiations for guaranteed, immediate cash advances. The industry detected her desperation and offered predatory terms. Studio executives viewed her vulnerability not as a tragedy, but as a rare market opportunity. Locked into brutal, high-volume production agreements, her physical body became the primary collateral for Kwok's financial survival. She was thrust into the center of an industrial meat grinder, forced into grueling wire-fu choreography, and suspended in restrictive harnesses for up to 14 hours a day. Chronic injuries and profound sleep deprivation instantly became the standard operating conditions of her debt-servicing machinery. Yet the physical exhaustion was merely the baseline of her suffering. The true horror of her daily existence resided in the impossible paradox of her dual obligations. She was required to satisfy the relentless, hypersexualized demands of a commercial film industry to generate the necessary capital, while simultaneously adhering to the tyrannical, paranoid mandates of absolute purity enforced by Martin Kwok. She was navigating a minefield where a single misstep, a rumored romance with a co-star, a wardrobe choice deemed too revealing by her partner, or a tabloid photograph captured from an unflattering angle could trigger a catastrophic psychological punishment at home. This impossible dynamic forced Carman Lee to develop a highly sophisticated system of micro-resistance. She was entirely trapped within the macro structure of the financial extraction. But on the micro level of the film set, she fought a silent, desperate war to maintain the final perimeters of her physical autonomy. Rare testimonies from crew members and archival production logs from her late 90s martial arts projects reveal a clear tactical pattern in her behavior. She was not acting like a traditional diva. She was acting like a hostage negotiating the terms of her confinement. She began systematically requesting highly specialized, multi-layered traditional garments for her roles. In the context of wuxia production, these heavy, flowing costumes were historically accurate, but for Carman Lee, they functioned as physical armor. The layers of silk and cotton neutralized any requirement for on-screen physical intimacy. They severely limited the amount of skin exposed to the camera and physically insulated her from the touch of her male co-stars. When a director, driven by the commercial formula, demanded a romantic sequence or a passionate embrace, she utilized her veteran technical mastery of the medium to manipulate the final product. She proactively dictated camera angles. She employed specific lighting techniques and spatial positioning to simulate close proximity without ever making actual substantive physical contact. These were not the artistic choices of a woman exploring the depths of a character. These were the desperate, calculated treaties of containment drafted by a woman attempting to keep a volatile, controlling partner pacified. She had to deliver the commercial product the studios demanded, but she had to sanitize it completely to ensure she did not violate Kwok's arbitrary standards of fidelity. She was managing the insecurities of a fallen tycoon while hanging from a wire rig 50 feet in the air. In the highly predatory environment of the 1990s Hong Kong glamour industry, other highly visible figures utilized different, often more collaborative defensive strategies to survive. The phenomenon of the lavender marriage, or the orchestrated public relationship, was a well-documented tactic. A highly scrutinized female star might enter into a mutually beneficial, highly publicized sham relationship with a trusted male colleague, often an actor seeking cover for his own private life. This arrangement provided a functional shield, neutralizing the aggressive surveillance of the paparazzi and satisfying the public's demand for a conventional narrative while allowing both parties to maintain their private boundaries. Carman Lee did not possess the freedom to utilize such decoys. Her defense mechanism was the absolute agonizing perfection of her own total isolation. She constructed a reality of such impenetrable, sterile purity that neither the rabid tabloid press nor her deeply suspicious partner could manufacture a single credible accusation of betrayal. She became utterly untouchable to everyone in the territory except the man who was systematically dismantling her life. Her isolation was absolute, and it set the stage for the most devastating weapon in the manipulator's arsenal. While the silent struggle for physical boundaries raged on the film sets, the core mechanism of the psychological execution was repeatedly deployed in the privacy of their shared residence. The most clinical, terrifying, and effective tactic Martin Kwok utilized to maintain absolute control over his primary asset was the weaponized breakup cycle. Over the course of their 10-year transaction, he initiated a specific, highly calculated sequence of sudden abandonment exactly 8 separate times. This was not the chaotic emotional volatility of a dysfunctional romance. It was a sophisticated forensic method of psychological torture designed to enforce total compliance and maximize financial extraction. It operated on the precise mechanics of coercive control, functioning as a regular stress test for her loyalty. The architecture of each cycle was identical and ruthlessly efficient. The trigger was rarely a genuine conflict. Kwok would abruptly manufacture a severe crisis, almost always citing a trivial fabricated violation of the arbitrary rules he had established. He might accuse her of failing to answer a phone call with sufficient speed, of attending an industry event he retroactively decided was inappropriate, or of failing to project the exact emotional tone he required upon his return home. He would leverage her inherent desire to be good, to be pure, and to be a supportive partner, twisting it into a weapon against her. He would definitively declare that her failure had fundamentally compromised his trust and that the relationship was permanently terminated. He would then execute the punishment phase, absolute, devastating silence. He would physically withdraw, severing all communication and affection. He would leave her entirely alone in the suffocating quiet of her apartment, isolated from her family, isolated from her industry peers, and entirely dependent on his approval for her fundamental sense of self-worth. The intended psychological reaction was guaranteed, and it was brutal. Exhausted from the physical labor of the film sets, severely sleep-deprived, and entirely stripped of any external support system, Carman Lee would shatter. The sudden, cold removal of the man she was sacrificing her entire life to save triggered a profound existential panic. The human brain, subjected to prolonged isolation and arbitrary punishment, will inevitably seek to restore the baseline of safety. Even if that safety is a cage, she would break the silence. She would initiate contact. She would plead for an audience. She would apologize profusely and desperately for transgressions she had not actually committed. She would internalize the blame entirely, convincing herself that if she had simply been more attentive, more compliant, or more perfect, the crisis would never have occurred. She assumed the full burden of his manufactured discontent. Most crucially for the transaction, she would offer immediate, tangible concessions. The breakup was the mechanism by which the terms of her servitude were continuously renegotiated in his favor. To secure his return, to end the agonizing silence, she would promise deeper submission. She would accept harsher restrictions on her movement and her professional choices, and inevitably, she would commit to securing more financial resources, accepting more grueling film contracts, to prove the absolute unshakable depth of her devotion. She utilized her labor to purchase his forgiveness for crimes she never committed. Once she had thoroughly prostrated herself, completely surrendered her boundaries, and renewed her commitment to the financial extraction process, Kwok would generously allow the relationship to resume. He would return, presenting himself not as the architect of her suffering, but as a merciful figure willing to grant her another chance to prove her worth. He conditioned her nervous system to view his mere presence as a profound reward, effectively masking the reality that his presence was the actual source of her destruction. Every single cycle of this manufactured abandonment eroded another structural layer of her psychological foundation. He was systematically training her to believe that any friction, any pain, and any financial distress within their shared reality was entirely her fault. He taught her that the only valid remedy for conflict was harder labor, greater financial sacrifice, and total self-abnegation. She passed every single one of the 8 stress tests. For a decade, she absorbed the escalating psychological abuse, endured the severe physical exhaustion of the Hong Kong action cinema machinery, and obediently handed over the entirety of her massive, unprecedented wealth. She functioned as the ultimate zero-maintenance financial shield for a failed tycoon. She absorbed the aggressive panic of his corporate creditors. She managed the grueling demands of the studio executives. and she internalized the calculated cruelty of her partner. She asked for absolutely nothing in return except the continuation of the cage she had been meticulously convinced was a sanctuary. The transaction was operating at maximum terrifying efficiency. The asset was secured, compliant, and highly productive. She was being systematically hollowed out year by year, film by film, contract by contract. The public continued to project their fantasies onto the pristine image of the little dragon maiden, completely blind to the reality that the woman behind the image was being ground into dust to balance a billionaire's ledger. The stage was now set for the final, most devastating phase of the operation. The debts were slowly being cleared, the property market was preparing to recover, and the absolute expiration date of Carman Lee's utility was rapidly approaching. By the early 2000s, the macroeconomic landscape of the Asian entertainment industry began to aggressively and permanently shift. The golden era of Hong Kong cinema was in a state of terminal decline, battered by the rampant proliferation of digital piracy, the devastating regional economic impact of the SARS epidemic, and the rapid, inevitable migration of capital and production infrastructure toward mainland China. The industry was rapidly shrinking, but the financial obligations Carman Lee carried on behalf of Martin Kwok remained absolute, non-negotiable, and unrelenting. The transaction had entered its most grueling attritional phase. She was no longer a superstar riding the cresting wave of an expanding market. She was a distressed, highly leveraged asset, forced to operate in a violently contracting economy. The slow-motion execution that began in the summer of 1997 was accelerating toward its inevitable destructive conclusion. By the early 2000s, the psychological cage was fully calcified. In the cold calculus of her daily reality, she faced three theoretical paths, all meticulously blocked dead ends. First, permanent surrender acting as a human ATM until her physical body failed under the relentless stress. Second, a financial buyout. But despite generating unprecedented revenue for a decade, her personal liquid assets were non-existent, immediately siphoned to service Kwok's corporate debt. Third, physical disappearance. But bypassing multi-picture contracts meant facing a deeply vindictive ecosystem backed by powerful syndicates, aided by a highly motivated tabloid surveillance network. All exit routes were strictly welded shut. Because all exit routes were neutralized, the final years leading up to 2008 became a masterclass in systemic, silent humiliation. The public narrative, carefully curated by studio publicists, maintained that the little dragon maiden was simply taking a dignified step back from the limelight, transitioning into a quieter, more selective phase of her career. The archival reality buried in underreported production logs and obscure mainland casting sheets reveals a far darker truth. Carman Lee was not resting. She was being relentlessly shuttled across the border into obscure, micro-budget mainland Chinese television productions. She was systematically stripped of her prestige. She was no longer commanding the definitive, culturally significant roles of her generation. She was forced to accept virtually any available contract, regardless of the script's quality, the director's competence, or the production's basic safety standards. Her sole operating mandate was to secure the immediate cash advances necessary to meet Kwok's aggressive, unyielding monthly payment demands. She was working in remote, grueling locations, separated from her home, functioning as a high-volume, low-margin debt service worker. The Hong Kong industry watched their defining icon degrade her own filmography to subsidize a failed tycoon, and the industry did absolutely nothing to intervene. They simply adjusted her day rate downward, capitalized on her desperation, and continued filming. This environment cultivated an atmosphere of absolute suffocating terror. It is the silent internal panic of a woman who realizes that her total compliance has not bought her safety. It has only subsidized her own prolonged destruction. She had spent 10 years aggressively convincing herself that staying, enduring the psychological abuse, and paying the colossal debts was the ultimate noble manifestation of moral loyalty. She had allowed the manipulator to weaponize her own inherent virtue against her. The transaction reached its absolute clinical climax in the year 2008. The global financial markets were once again entering a period of catastrophic volatility, culminating in the subprime mortgage crisis. But localized within Martin Kwok's specific, heavily insulated corporate empire, the ledger had finally been balanced. Thanks to a decade of ruthless restructuring, the gradual recovery of the Hong Kong property market in the mid-2000s, and the total systematic exfiltration of Carman Lee's wealth and physical labor, his debts were cleared. His holding companies were solvent. His social standing among the financial elite had been fully and completely restored. He was whole again. The precise second his financial integrity was secured, his requirement for Carman Lee was instantly and permanently terminated. The event was processed by the media as a standard, albeit high-profile celebrity breakup. The press releases were sterile, calculated, and entirely devoid of context. Martin Kwok unilaterally ended the relationship, citing a fundamental incompatibility of character. He delivered the execution with the cold, detached, sociopathic efficiency of a board member closing an underperforming, obsolete division. The tabloid media, predictably savage and deeply misogynistic, immediately turned their weapons on Carman Lee. They framed her not as a victim of a decade-long financial extraction, but as a foolish, 42-year-old woman who had gambled her youth on a billionaire and failed to secure a marriage certificate. She was mocked in the press as a depreciated asset, a woman who had aged out of her market value and was now being rightfully discarded by a successful man who required a newer model. This was not a romantic dissolution. It was a premeditated corporate liquidation. Over the decade, Kwok had engineered a mechanism that converted a human being into an asset with zero equity. By 2008, Carman Lee's personal wealth was depleted, her commercial fame diluted by low-tier debt servicing roles, and her psychological endurance shattered. In the pure algorithmic logic of the transaction, her removal was a mandatory financial correction. She had transformed from a high-yield asset into a liability. The 8 previous breakups were behavioral stress tests. The 2008 termination was the final permanent write-off. He took her peak decade, secured his fortune, and cleanly locked her out of the fortress she had built. The psychological shockwave of this liquidation was catastrophic, but it was immediately compounded by a devastating biological strike. The following year, in 2009, her father suddenly passed away. The collision of these two massive traumas, the absolute cold-blooded betrayal by the man she had sacrificed her entire identity to save, and the permanent loss of the father who represented the only remaining source of genuine unconditional love in her life, completely and violently shattered her remaining psychological infrastructure. The public witnessed what appeared to be a textbook, catastrophic mental breakdown. Carman Lee vanished from the industry entirely. The reports that leaked from her inner circle, eventually confirmed by her own retrospective accounts, painted a terrifying portrait of a woman in rapid, uncontrolled freefall. She barricaded herself inside her apartment, refusing to leave for weeks at a time. The enforced purity, the strict dietary restrictions, and the rigid physical discipline she had maintained for decades violently inverted into a severe, uncontrollable eating disorder. She exhibited highly self-destructive patterns, engaging in episodes of massive binge eating, consuming up to 1 kilogram of dense pastries and sweets in a single sitting, only to spend hours violently purging in front of her bathroom mirror. The darkness rapidly deepened into profound, acute, suicidal ideation. She would stand completely paralyzed for hours on the balcony of her 27th floor apartment. She would stare down at the concrete below, fighting an overwhelming, almost magnetic gravitational pull to simply step off the edge and silence the relentless agony of her own consciousness. In the dead of night, unable to sleep, her mind racing with the incomprehensible reality of her betrayal, she would drive her car aimlessly through the deserted, neon-lit streets of Hong Kong. She would eventually arrive at the cemetery, sitting alone among the graves in total, profound silence, consumed by the wreckage of her own reality. The media, the entertainment industry, and the general public categorized this behavior as madness. They labeled it the tragic but inevitable collapse of a fragile actress who simply could not handle the loss of her beauty, her youth, and her billionaire protector. This analysis is fundamentally flawed. It represents a total failure to understand the mechanics of profound trauma. When examined through the forensic lens of coercive control and systemic abuse, her behavior in 2009 was not a descent into madness. It was her final, desperate, and highly tactical act of absolute rebellion. It was the moment of her true escapement. For 10 years, the system that exploited her required her to remain highly functional. She had to be physically presentable for the cameras. She had to be mentally coherent enough to memorize scripts and execute complex choreography. She had to be emotionally stable enough to endure the daily psychological abuse and continue generating capital for Kwok. The manipulator absolutely required her to be a perfectly calibrated operating object of labor. By totally and completely collapsing into non-functional visceral trauma, she rendered herself entirely useless to the machinery of her exploitation. She broke the product. The eating disorder, the absolute isolation, the screaming in the graveyard. This was her subconscious taking the wheel and violently shutting down the operating systems. It was a physiological, scorched earth protocol. She was fundamentally destroying her own capacity to be utilized as a commodity. Her psychosis was not a symptom of her inherent weakness. It was the ultimate, impenetrable firewall erected by her mind to prevent any further extraction. She could not verbally articulate her refusal to be used anymore, so her body articulated it for her through complete systemic failure. By becoming an erratic, self-destructive, and publicly unstable liability, she ensured that neither Martin Kwok nor the predatory studio system could ever plug her back into the debt-servicing machine. The trauma was agonizing and profoundly real, but it also functioned as the exact mechanism of her liberation. She did not collapse because she was defeated by the tycoon. She collapsed because, on a primal, survival-driven level, she finally chose to be a broken object rather than a functioning slave. The transaction was definitively over. The system had successfully extracted her wealth, but through the extreme violence of her own breakdown, She had successfully extracted her soul from the system. She was in ruins, standing on the edge of the 27th floor, but for the first time in a decade, the ruins belonged entirely to her. The reconstruction of a completely decimated human psyche is never a cinematic, rapidly edited montage of sudden inspiration and immediate healing. It is a brutal, microscopic, and deeply unglamorous process of reclaiming neurological territory inch by bloody inch from the occupying force of profound compounded trauma. As the timeline crossed from the wreckage of 2009 into the early 2010s, Carman Lee existed entirely in the desolate wasteland left behind by the transaction. She had successfully utilized total psychological collapse as a scorched earth protocol to permanently sever her connection to Martin Kwok, but the resulting isolation possessed its own form of terminal suffocating gravity. She was a woman stranded in the absolute ruins of her own meticulously engineered self-destruction. The financial extraction phase of her life had conclusively ended, but the physiological and neurological debt of a relentless 10-year stress response remained entirely unpaid. Her nervous system was shattered, caught in a perpetual loop of hypervigilance and profound exhaustion. The specific horror of this period lies in the daily operational reality of a discarded cultural icon, the Hong Kong entertainment machinery, which had ruthlessly exploited her physical labor and capitalized on her public aura for over a decade, did not pause to mourn her collapse. The industry operates on a foundation of absolute pragmatism. When the Little Dragon Maiden ceased to be a functional, compliant, and profitable asset, the studios simply erased her from the active board. They seamlessly pivoted their marketing budgets and production schedules toward a new, younger, and significantly cheaper generation of actresses, women who had not yet been ground down by the syndicate-backed production demands or financially hollowed out by predatory tycoons. Carman Lee was left in a terrifying vacuum. She possessed the residual haunting fame of a global superstar, making simple anonymity impossible. But she lacked the financial security, the industry backing, and the basic psychological stability required to function in daily society. She was a highly recognizable ghost haunting her own life. Traditional therapeutic interventions often fail in cases of extreme, long-term coercive control because the manipulator has fundamentally rewired the victim's perception of reality, trust, and authority. For Carman Lee, the catalyst for her resurrection did not arrive in the form of a grand, lucrative industry comeback, nor did it manifest through traditional psychiatric counseling. It arrived through the introduction of specific non-negotiable micro-anchors. These anchors were tiny, almost imperceptible tethers to the physical present tense world that slowly, mechanically pulled her back from the psychological ledge of the 27th floor. The primary and most critical anchor was strictly biological and entirely unexpected: the birth of her sister's daughter. By the time the transaction with Kwok concluded, Carman Lee had been stripped of her own immediate future and completely divested of her maternal timeline by the grueling decade of servitude. She suddenly found herself tasked with the intensive, daily care of an infant niece. In the clinical analysis of trauma recovery, this is not a sentimental detail. It is a profound, life-saving psychological intervention. The requirement to care for a fragile, entirely dependent human life forced her traumatized brain out of the continuous paralyzing loop of its own internal suffering. An infant does not care about the collapse of the Asian real estate market in 1997. An infant does not understand the predatory nature of studio contracts, nor does it possess any awareness of Martin Kwok's corporate balance sheets. It simply requires a rigid, functional, and immediate schedule of care. It requires the caregiver to stand up, to prepare food, to maintain hygiene, and to exist entirely in the present tense. For Carman Lee, this meant her physical labor was, for the first time in over a decade, being deployed for pure, unadulterated, non-transactional care. She was no longer working to desperately appease a corporate predator or satisfy the impossible demands of a studio executive. She was working to sustain a life that offered nothing in return but its own existence. This externalization of purpose acted as a biological pacemaker, slowly restarting the rhythm of her daily life and forcing her to rebuild a basic infrastructure of functional routines. The second crucial anchor arrived much later, providing a sudden piercing moment of external clarity that shattered the hermetically sealed echo chamber of her depression. It occurred during a rare, unavoidable excursion, a commercial flight where she coincidentally crossed paths with Chow Yun-fat. The weight of this encounter becomes clear when contextualizing Chow Yun-fat within the hierarchy of the Asian entertainment ecosystem. He is not merely a successful actor. He is the undisputed, universally respected patriarch of Hong Kong cinema. He operates with an authority that entirely transcends the petty, vindictive machinery of the studios and the tabloid press. He is immune to the system. When Chow Yun-fat looked at Carman Lee on that flight, he did not see the flawless, ethereal little dragon maiden, nor did he see the broken, discarded liability the tabloids had manufactured. He saw a veteran of the same brutal industry, and he recognized the specific, hollowed-out stare of a survivor who had given up. Crucially, he did not offer her pity. Pity is a corrosive element for trauma survivors. It reinforces the narrative of total victimhood and permanently cements their status as a casualty. Instead, Chow Yun-fat asked her a brutally simple, highly operational question regarding what she was actually doing with her physical body, her daily schedule, and her remaining time on Earth. He challenged the absolute finality of her defeat. He did not offer platitudes about healing or time. He effectively reminded her that while the tycoon had successfully liquidated her financial assets and the industry had consumed her youth, they had not actually succeeded in terminating her biological existence. She was still breathing. Her heart was still pumping blood. Therefore, the ledger was not fully closed, and the narrative was not permanently over. In a reality where Martin Kwok had used words entirely to manipulate, confuse, and trap her, Chow Yun-fat used words to deliver a sharp, undeniable slap of objective reality. He demanded agency. This specific, unvarnished interaction triggered a radical, permanent shift in her survival strategy. Carman Lee did not respond to this awakening by returning to the production offices to beg for the scraps of her former glory. She did not attempt to reclaim her space in an industry that had fundamentally failed to protect her. Instead, she turned her back on the studios entirely. She walked into a gymnasium. To the untrained, superficial observer, the sudden, obsessive pivot of a middle-aged former television actress into the grueling discipline of bodybuilding appears to be a desperate, vanity-driven attempt to arrest the biological aging process. It is frequently dismissed as an attempt to reclaim the visual currency of her youth, to remain relevant in a media landscape obsessed with aesthetics. This shallow analysis entirely misses the specific, deeply tactical nature of trauma recovery and physical reclamation. For Carman Lee, The gymnasium was never a beauty parlor. It was a heavily fortified armory. For 10 excruciating years, her physical body had been legally and functionally classified as corporate collateral. Her appearance, her body weight, her clothing, and her physical proximity to others had been aggressively, violently micromanaged by a man who viewed her biology as his exclusive leased property. Furthermore, the Hong Kong entertainment industry had built her entire mythological value upon the specific concept of fragile, untouchable, pale weakness. The archetype of the little dragon maiden was undoubtedly powerful in the context of the fiction, but aesthetically and physically, she was a delicate porcelain artifact, requiring constant protection and gentle handling. The public loved her because she looked like she could be easily broken. When Carman Lee began aggressively lifting heavy iron, systematically building dense, highly visible muscle mass, and meticulously documenting her physical transformation, she was executing a profound, calculated act of violent rebellion. She was actively and visibly dismantling the porcelain artifact the public and the tycoon had demanded. She was constructing a physical architecture that was undeniably biologically and exclusively her own. The mechanics of bodybuilding are fundamentally anti-transactional in the context of coercive control. Muscle tissue cannot be inherited from a wealthy family. It cannot be negotiated in a boardroom. It cannot be bought by a tycoon to balance a ledger. And it absolutely cannot be faked on a cinematic soundstage. It must be forged through isolated individual suffering and absolute unwavering discipline. By forcing her body to adapt to extreme, localized physical stress on her own terms, she was methodically overriding the neurological pathways of her previous victimhood. She was transforming a physical body that had been used as a silent, compliant sponge for corporate debt into a hardened, impenetrable machine of self-reliance. The daily routine of the gym provided the ultimate antidote to the unpredictable terror of her past. Inside the weight room, the environment is entirely controlled. The iron does not manipulate, it does not lie, and it does not initiate a manufactured breakup cycle to test her loyalty. 50 pounds is always exactly 50 pounds. The transaction is perfectly honest. She applies physical force, she endures the micro-tearing of the muscle fibers, and in response, the body fortifies itself, growing denser, stronger, and more resilient. By subjecting herself to this voluntary, highly controlled physical stress, she was actively training her nervous system to process and manage the involuntary, uncontrolled psychological stress of the past decade. Every repetition was a physical rejection of the mandate that she must remain weak, submissive, and perfectly pure. Her current massive presence on digital platforms, where she consistently demonstrates her vascularity, her core strength, and her physical power to millions of followers, is the ultimate undeniable rejection of the 1990s demand for female fragility. She is no longer the pure, passive maiden waiting silently in the ancient tomb for a savior or predator. She is the undisputed architect of her own physical sovereignty. When she looks directly into the camera lens today, the gaze is completely devoid of the desperate compliance, the manufactured serenity, and the hidden panic that defined her youth. It is the cold, steady, heavily armored gaze of a woman who has walked through the absolute fire of complete corporate and psychological liquidation and emerged, forged in iron. She has successfully transferred the value of her existence from the fragile, easily manipulated realm of public perception directly into the dense, unyielding reality of her own physical strength. Survival is frequently and incorrectly framed by popular culture as a return to a pre-trauma state of normalcy. The media narrative demands a clean resolution where the victim emerges from the darkness, healed, whole, and ready to reintegrate into the very societal structures that previously facilitated their destruction. The forensic reality of recovering from a decade of extreme systemic coercive control is entirely different. The trauma of the transaction leaves permanent structural damage on the human psyche. Carman Lee's physical resurrection in the gymnasium, her undeniable reclamation of her biological sovereignty, represents a highly functional, fiercely guarded, but ultimately fragile piece. She rebuilt the external walls of the fortress with iron and discipline, but the interior architecture of her trust had been fundamentally and permanently incinerated. The psychological aftermath of the Martin Kwok transaction is most visible in Carman Lee's explicit, non-negotiable decision regarding her personal life. She has made an absolute public commitment to remain permanently single. She explicitly articulates a philosophy that equates romantic love directly with a shackle. The Asian tabloid media, continuously operating on a foundation of deeply entrenched misogyny, frequently attempts to frame this decision as a tragedy. They project a narrative of a lonely, aging spinster, a woman who is still secretly nursing a broken heart for the tycoon who discarded her, or a casualty who simply lost her market value in the romantic economy. This framing is a complete misinterpretation of her survival strategy. In the context of the dark premium file, her permanent isolation is the ultimate highly rational security protocol. The 10-year financial and emotional extraction did merely bankrupt her bank accounts. It permanently bankrupted her fundamental capacity for intimate trust. Martin Kwok weaponized the very concept of love. He took her inherent altruism, her culturally ingrained desire for connection, and her willingness to compromise, and he converted those exact traits into the precise instruments of her torture. He taught her, through clinical, relentless repetition, that intimacy is a highly dangerous trap. He proved that vulnerability is nothing more than an open invitation for financial extraction, and that a romantic partner is simply a predator operating under the socially acceptable cover of affection. By refusing to ever re-enter the romantic marketplace, Carman Lee is enforcing a strict, zero-tolerance policy against any future exploitation. She has recognized, through devastating empirical evidence, that the system of external validation she once sacrificed her physical and mental health to secure is fundamentally rigged against her. She prefers the absolute, unyielding coldness of solitude to the terrifying calculus of another intimate transaction. She is a survivor who has locked the heavy steel doors to her fortress from the inside, fully aware of the monsters that successfully operate in the guise of sophisticated saviors. She is alone, and as she explicitly states to the press, she is completely safe. The trauma fundamentally rewired her risk assessment matrix. Love, in her verified experience, yields a negative return on investment and carries a catastrophic risk of total liquidation. She simply closed the account. While the survivor maintains her heavily fortified solitary peace, the investigative lens must pivot to examine the fate of the architect. The consequences for Martin Kwok, the man who meticulously designed and executed this decade-long human liquidation, provide the most chilling indictment of the entire Hong Kong corporate ecosystem. In the pure, unadulterated reality of the city's financial hierarchy, There were absolutely no consequences. Martin Kwok faced zero social ostracization. He faced zero legal prosecution for financial coercion, emotional abuse, or the systemic dismantling of a woman's psychological autonomy. The legal frameworks of 1990s and 2000s Hong Kong possessed no vocabulary for the concept of coercive control. The judicial system was designed to protect physical property and corporate contracts. It offered absolutely no protection against the psychological subjugation of an intimate partner behind closed doors. Kwok successfully identified and exploited a massive, unregulated loophole in the human experience. Because he did not physically assault her in public, and because she voluntarily signed the predatory studio contracts to generate the cash he required, his actions were legally classified as a private, albeit unfortunate, relationship dynamic. Once his holding companies were entirely stabilized by the millions of dollars generated from her forced physical labor, he simply seamlessly reintegrated into the upper echelons of the financial elite. His corporate balance sheets were clean. His public reputation as a ruthless but highly effective survivor of the 1997 Asian financial crisis was permanently solidified. In the exclusive boardrooms overlooking Victoria Harbor, his specific methodology for managing his massive debt was heavily insulated from moral scrutiny. The utilization of a famous, highly profitable actress as a disposable, unpaid shock absorber for his corporate liabilities was quietly respected as a highly efficient, unsentimental restructuring strategy. He successfully transferred the entirety of his systemic risk onto a vulnerable individual, absorbed her capital, and discarded the liability when her utility expired. In the cold mathematics of Hong Kong capitalism, he executed a flawless maneuver. The system of exploitation itself did not fracture when Carman Lee collapsed on that 27th floor balcony. It simply recalibrated its targeting parameters. The Hong Kong entertainment industry moved forward, completely unbothered by the total destruction of its defining cultural icon. Studio executives continued to draft predatory, multi-year indentured servitude contracts. The paparazzi continued to enforce impossible, suffocating standards of purity upon the next generation of young women entering the Kowloon studios. The machinery identified the broken component, ejected it onto the street, and immediately slotted a new, younger, more naive asset into the exact same transactional matrix. The complicity extended far beyond the boardrooms and the studio lots. The public audience, the millions of fans who had elevated Carman Lee to the status of a deity, actively participated in the final phase of her erasure. When the tabloids published the details of her eating disorder and her severe depression, the public did not rally to dismantle the system that had crushed her. The audience consumed her breakdown with the same ravenous appetite they had previously consumed her pristine cinematic image. They demanded a flawless goddess, and when the machinery finally broke the woman attempting to maintain that illusion, the audience simply changed the channel to find a new, unbroken idol to worship. The collective demand for an untouchable, pure icon created the very vacuum that a corporate predator successfully utilized to isolate and destroy her. The society demanded a woman who was entirely above the dirty reality of money and transaction, ensuring she was completely defenseless when a man arrived with a ledger, a crisis, and a meticulously designed cage. This dynamic exposes the core hypocrisy of the entire era. The public condemned the women who openly traded their youth for financial security, labeling them gold diggers or opportunists. Yet the biography of Carman Lee proves that the alternative was exponentially more dangerous. She attempted to operate on pure, unselfish devotion. She attempted to save her partner through sheer labor and absolute loyalty. Her history stands as a brutal empirical warning that in a hyper-capitalist environment, completely devoid of moral safeguards, absolute loyalty is the most dangerous, fatal financial liability a woman can possess. It signals to predators that the asset will not defend itself during the extraction process. Her current status as a completely autonomous, heavily armored physical entity represents a historical anomaly. She is the statistical outlier in the casualty reports of the Hong Kong Golden Era. She survived the absolute depletion of her capital and the systematic dismantling of her nervous system because she successfully executed a biological scorched earth protocol. By refusing to ever speak Martin Kwok's name in the press, by denying the tabloids the retroactive drama they constantly demand, she executes the ultimate continuous power move. She denies the system any further data extraction. Her silence regarding the architect of her destruction is not a symptom of lingering trauma. It is the implementation of an absolute permanent embargo. She has classified the tycoon as irrelevant to her current operational reality. Yet, acknowledging her survival requires us to examine the terrifying mortality rate of her immediate peers. The system that failed to permanently bury Carman Lee possessed other, far more efficient methodologies for liquidating compromised assets. When isolation, financial extraction, and psychological abuse failed to resolve an institutional liability, the machinery of the 1990s and early 2000s occasionally required a permanent, non-negotiable physical conclusion. Carman Lee survived the machine by breaking herself first, but the system had other far more permanent methodologies for liquidating assets that could not be contained. Revealing the true mortality rate of this golden era requires a pivot from the survivor who escaped to the apex icon who fell. The spring of 2003 presented a completely different operational matrix. The SARS epidemic had transformed Hong Kong into a terrified quarantine zone. Within this macro-level crisis, a micro-level transaction of unfathomable magnitude was reaching its terminal velocity on the 24th floor of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. The date was April 1st, 2003. The subject of this next file was not a female actress trapped by the patriarchal mandates of purity. This individual was the undisputed apex predator of raw talent in Asian cinema. He was a figure who transcended market demographics, genre limitations, and gender boundaries. He commanded an unprecedented level of absolute global adoration, operating at a tier of fame that rendered him entirely immune to the standard predatory tactics of the studio executives. He was wealthy beyond the reach of corporate manipulation. He was critically acclaimed across continents. He appeared by every conceivable metric to be the one entity that the Hong Kong machinery could not consume. The official, universally accepted historical narrative dictates that at 6:43 p.m. on that Tuesday evening, this transcendent icon, overwhelmed by a severe, sudden onset of clinical depression, simply walked out of a private health club on the 24th floor, climbed the railing, and stepped into the void. The subsequent impact on the pavement below triggered a shock wave of grief that effectively paralyzed the entire continent. The death was immediately processed, documented, and mourned by the authorities, the press, and the public as a tragic, accidental suicide. It was categorized as an open and shut case of profound artistic fragility colliding with a chemical imbalance. A forensic audit of this specific event immediately exposes structural anomalies, in the official narrative. When the emotional hysteria of the public mourning is stripped away, the timeline leading up to 6:43 p.m. reveals a sequence of highly calculated, deeply obscured pressures. Beyond the clinical diagnosis of depression, it demands scrutiny of the massive financial entities heavily leveraged against his upcoming projects, and the sudden, inexplicable shifts in high-value estate planning executed just weeks prior. The next file opens the darkest operational reality of Asian entertainment, exposing the final hours, the hidden ledgers, and the silent forces that gathered on the 24th floor.